Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, to our listeners and viewers who join us from all over the world. We're so thrilled that it's growing and there's so many of you tuning in as we dive into what we hope is meaningful dialogue, particularly around the subject of Palestine, where we feel that insight and context is often missing from mainstream legacy media. But it's also for us often an opportunity just to celebrate Palestine's traditions and culture and heritage. Today, we have a wonderful guest with us. We're excited to be joined by Dr. Raz Segal, the Israeli-American Holocaust scholar who courageously called Gaza a textbook case of genocide just days after October 7th. Raz, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
Hello, Shamim. Thank you so much for having me, and hello to you as well, Hanan. It's a pleasure being here in discussion with you.
Wonderful. Let me just give our audiences a little bio on you if they don't know who you are, which they should. Dr. Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University, where he directs the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. His books include Genocide in the Carpathians, War, Social Breakdown and Mass Violence, 1914 to 1945, and Days of Ruin. Hanan, how did we meet Raz? Give us that story.
Yeah, well, we connected through Raz's fearless scholarship, refusing to let the Holocaust memory be weaponized to justify the genocide and the settler colonialism against Palestinians. And I think because Raz showed the moral courage we desperately need in today's world, we were very thrilled to have you. And Ahlan officially, and welcome, Raz, and really excited to start the podcast with you. So can we start with your story? You're Israeli, you grew up with Zionist beliefs, and now you're one of the most prominent voices calling Israeli actions in Gaza a genocide. And that's quite a journey. We'd love to start with your childhood. What were you taught about Israel and how to think about Palestine and quote unquote Arabs, a term often used by Israelis to refer to Palestinians to erase their identity? We'd love to know more about your childhood and background.
Thank you so much again for this opportunity to be in discussion with you. If to go immediately to the key, I think, issue about the way that I remember growing up in Israel. Is it was really about Jewish supremacy, but it wasn't about Jewish supremacy, for me growing up, right, as a kid. Of course, it wasn't as a well articulated ideological framework, right? But it was about an issue that is very, very important, uniqueness, right? So it was about the idea that at the base, in a very basic way, it's about Jews as a unique people, and it's about the Israeli state as a unique state. It was about, anti-Semitism as a unique, let's call it hatred, right? And it was about the righteousness of the Israeli state project that was also based, right, on, of course, the idea that the Holocaust was a unique event in human history. Now, again, none of this was articulated for the kid, who I was, in a kind of, well thought out way, but it was really, I would say, a matter of feeling, right? Um, and 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 that kind of, that was also that came through very clearly. And I think not only for me, of course, but if I think about the Israeli public education system, right? Schools, you know, days of commemoration, of course, right? Both for, Israel's wars and for Holocaust Remembrance Day. Um, uh, but also just in the kind of, I would say, um, it was matter of fact, right? We are, and in that sense, I have to say, I'm not sure that it's significantly, I'm not sure that it's, that it's in essence different than other national frameworks of thought and feeling, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it was a matter of fact thing, right? Jews are unique. The Israeli state project is unique. And we are, and it's an absolutely 100% righteous project. And Israel's wars are about what we call today, self-defense, right? Because everyone hates us and everyone has always hated us and everyone will always hate us. Now, in that framework, of course, Palestinians, right, um, very rarely enter the picture in any significant way, right? Um, and uh, and I wouldn't even say denial, right? Um, but you know, perhaps disavowal is a more appropriate term in that sense, right? Pushing something to the margins, so much so that it becomes irrelevant, right? You don't, so, denial, the problem with denial is it requires engagement. Disavowal works in a different way, precisely in order to prevent engagement, right? Um, and that's in that sense, Palestinians don't enter the picture so much in any significant way, except of course, um, uh, as quote unquote terrorists, for example, right? Um, Sometimes, again, if I'm talking about the way that I remember, my child growing up, right, and living in Israel. So terrorists, yes, right. Um, there is also, an older association of Palestinians with Nazis well before October 7th, right? Um, but terrorists was, so danger, of course, right? Threat. And it was, but, interestingly, it was a threat that was, of course, completely decontextualized, right? So there was no, I have to say, I knew, growing up and also as a, teenager, a young, I knew very little really about the history of the Israeli state. I knew next to nothing about Palestine, right? Palestinians. Um, Now, mind you, this is all, uh, uh, this is a state where today a bit more than 20% of its citizens are Palestinians, right? So when you think about, say, Tel Aviv, which was a very important city in my life for quite some time, right? So it's, right next to Jaffa, right? Of course, Israel is also a very segregated society, right? So there is very little meaningful interaction, really, and long-lasting interaction between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews. There is, for example, people see and meet Palestinians a lot on the streets, in hospitals, for example, but there's very little meaningful interactions, right? So, and that's, I think, also something that we can think about in this framework of disavowal, right?
Yeah.
That it's very, t it's in that sense, it's very similar to, and I'm thinking specifically about Kevin Brunel's book on settler memory about the U.S., where he employs the term of disavowal, right? That it's not that people don't know about, a native genocide in the U.S., right? It's that it's pushed to the margins in a way that it really becomes completely relevant, right? Specifically to the present. Um, so that's kind of, in fragments, the way that I remember um, growing up in Israel and developing this kind of, you might say, Zionist consciousness, right? Um, uh, and really, but really what was most characteristic about it was this idea about uniqueness, right? Jews are unique, Israel is unique, anti-Semitism is unique, the Holocaust was unique, right? And with uniqueness, of course, this kind of idea of an all-encompassing righteousness,
Mm.
right, to the Israeli state project. And I also just one last thing about this, that, this feeling, again, it's all based on feelings, right? That, this tr very strong uh, feeling of belonging, right? To the place, uh, and thinking that, for example, say the mountains in the north of Israel, the Galil Mountains, right? There was a time in my life that I imagined them as probably the most beautiful mountains in the world, this kind of thing, right? And
Yeah.
granted, there's some beautiful spots in those mountains, but I never really imagined them as the homeland of Palestinians, right? For such a long period of time, of course, before the 1948 Nakba and the ongoing Nakba until today, the continued assault on Palestinians in the Galil, right? Um, so I would even say it wasn't really about negative feelings about Palestinians as much as it was about, Palestinians simply really literally don't exist, right, in this emotional Zionist framework.
Yeah, yeah. That's so, that's powerful stuff, and you can see that that is the case when you hear that, 80% of Israel is now, wanting to finish the job in Gaza or whatever it might be. So, of course, it's a very strong uh, message to permeate through anybody. But as a novelist and a filmmaker, so what fascinates me is how we're here now. What's the transformation? And of course, I don't want a Hollywood ending, but I'm just interested to know. You went from the Zionist upbringing, as you said. You studied at Tel Aviv University under Yehuda Bauer, one of the most renowned Holocaust scholars. Was there a particular moment or something specific that began to crack open your worldview and make you start questioning in a world that didn't really encourage that, if that's fair to say?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. There was no moment, right, as it were. There were various moments that were significant, perhaps in this journey. I would say it's a very long journey, right? More than a decade, probably, right, of this kind of transformation, which was very difficult on a personal level for various reasons. But um, I- it's important to say also that, so I was born in 1976, right? It's also important to note that after the 1967 war, the military occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, uh, there's the emergence of the post-1967 religious Zionist settler movement,
Mm.
right? And I know this because, the way that I remember growing up, so my context is a very secular family, right? In kind of in the Tel Aviv area. Uh, and I'm noting this because from the 70s and until today, we see this emergence not just of the religious Zionist project of settlement in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, right? And there's what, 800,000, probably a bit more Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem today, which is an incredible success of this settler project, right? In that sense. But they also had an additional program, which is they called it to settle in the hearts of Israelis, right? So that even if you are not religious Zionist, even if you're secular, if you're an anti-religious, Jewish Zionist, whatever that everyone adopts, right? The post-67 religious Zionist framework, which of course has its roots in Zionist thought more generally and the Greater Israel idea, but it's now infused in with this kind of religious content. It's much more militant, uh, um, and it's I would say, uh, uh, and a certain kind of escalation, right? And in the early 70s, of course, these people were considered crazy people in Israel and a small minority, no resources, nothing, right? Today they control the state, right? Um, so I mentioned this because mostly in order to say that what we might call the post-Second Intifada generation in Israel, right? So people who indeed, after October 2023, right, were serving in the Israeli military, right? Um, and that's true in some sense also to people who were born before the Second Intifada, so maybe in reserve in Gaza after October 2023 in this genocidal war, right? These are people who already grew up, right, in the last 20 to 30 years in a state that was, I would say heading towards the escalation of the ongoing Nakba, right, into its kind of genocidal conclusion. Not to say that it's inevitable, right? Nothing I think is inevitable, right? Just as I don't think that the Holocaust, say, was, inevitable, right, in European history. But what we see today in Gaza, the Gaza genocide, is the ongoing Nakba taken to its illogical conclusion, right? So I just wanted to add this in terms of my own background and what's going on in Israel at the time that I was growing up. Now, in terms of the transformation, uh, again, as I said, there's a process of more than a decade, and what really defines this process is my interest in the Holocaust and in anti-Semitism. And I laugh because, as I said, I came to this interest from a very Jewish supremacist perspective. And as you noted, I mean, I studied with Yehuda Bauer. He never taught in Tel Aviv University, he was already retired actually, but he gave a special seminar in Tel Aviv University where I was doing a master's in Jewish history, because that's how I understood at the time studying the Holocaust, going to do a master's in Jewish history. And that's how I met Yehuda Bauer. And Yehuda Bauer was, of course, one of the founders of what's called the Jerusalem School in Jewish History and Holocaust Studies. So, uh, uh, you know, a Jewish supremacist framework about, history and about the Holocaust and about Israel and about anti-Semitism. And that's and for that first book that you mentioned that I wrote, which was really a reworking of my master thesis, Days of Ruin, is fine, but it's really my Jerusalem school days, right? The Genocide in the Carpathians is a very different book. It's a reworking of my doctoral dissertation that I did under the supervision of Deborah Dwork at Clark University, at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies that she founded at Clark University. And, the board work is the person who really had immense impact on, in a very important time in this journey on me, right? And so, so if there's really, it's important to say that, if I'm a student of someone, I'm a student of the board work, first and foremost, right? But at that time, Yehuda Bauer had a very, I looked up to someone like Yehuda Bauer, as many people did. Um, and that's how I came to, and I knew nothing, right? So as I said, a lot of this was based on feelings, right? I didn't know anything about the Holocaust. I didn't know anything about anti-Semitism. I didn't know anything about Israel. It was, uh, um, but I had this feeling of Jewish supremacy, right? So
Yeah.
uniqueness was, and I remember that in the early stages of it, engaging with debates about uniqueness, uh, um, it was very difficult for me actually to engage with the debates because I quickly discovered in academic context that my arguments were rather weak. Um, but again, and this is really, to say that the journey that I took was really a journey of learning, right? So as I started to learn more about the Holocaust and as I started to learn more about anti-Semitism, and parallel to this, for various reasons, um, I also started to learn more about Israel and Palestine. Um, and this learning process was really a process which was defined in its early stages and for quite some time by a lot of rejection and insistence, right? So rejecting whatever I learned that didn't seem to fit what, how I imagined and felt about these issues and these histories, and insisting on uniqueness, basically, right? One thing, though, that really I think pushed me through this process, which is, again, was very, very difficult for me on a personal level, and I might, I'll say this just it was difficult because really in through this process I had lost completely my sense of belonging, right? And in a way I don't feel at home anywhere today. And this is also a feeling, and I know that we can think about home in various ways, and it's not just about a feeling, it's about also all kinds of very important material issues, relationships, connection, but there's still a feeling in it that I had lost, right? So that was, I think, that was what really defined this difficulty of the process. But what really pushed me through this process was the idea that I really took seriously in a very naive way, right? The idea about Holocaust memory that is encapsulated in the UN Genocide Convention from 1948 with the word in the title of prevention, right? It's the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, right? And Holocaust memory, right? Never again, right? If you think about it naively, which I was, uh, um, it is very much related actually to prevention, right? Not never again only for Jews, right? But never again, right? So this and that is like that provided me the kind of the window, right, to go through this process because, you know, um, I was also not a fanatic. So that at some point, I learned and learned and learned, and I rejected and pushed away and tried to rationalize or whatever. But at some points, there was things that, I had to start coming to terms with, especially because, I did think that I was in that sense a believer in modern progress, right? That the world is continuously a better place, right? And Holocaust memory is part of that framework, right? And um, so that was really what guided me because, the more I learned and, went through this kind of rejection and started to accept more things and engage with more people, and especially after I moved to the US for my doctoral program at Clark University, that was 2007. So meeting more people and also starting to look at things from other perspectives that is also from outside, right? Which is very significant. Um, you know, the idea of Holocaust memory never again, right? In terms of what I was learning, right? And also in terms of how I was seeing that in this field of Holocaust studies or you say Holocaust and genocide studies, right? The way that we were dealing and still are and for the most part with what we call the Holocaust, right? This complex set of events and processes that together we call the Holocaust. I was seeing that there were a lot of problems with that, right? Um, because it was based on uniqueness, right? Because it was based on decontextualization, because it was based on the idea that, Jewish lives mattered than other lives, and specifically in the Israeli-Palestine context, on Palestinian lives. And of course, you know, uh, uh, through that time, so we're already talking about after I moved to the US, right? The Israeli siege of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip begins, repeated Israeli attacks on Gaza, and a further intensification of the settlement project in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, more and more violence, more and more displacement, more and more mass robbery and theft. So, obviously, as time passed, right, the Israeli state more and more emerged for me, right, as an agent of violence, right, as something that is not creating a world that is committed really to Holocaust memory, but actually as a state that's weaponizing Holocaust memory, right? And it's not by accident that in my doctoral dissertation, already as I was writing the dissertation, in a couple of times, two very significant times, I had some very significant disagreements, and I would even say, intense fights, I would say, with Yehuda Bauer, right? Who was not happy with, and this was about what we might call the Holocaust in the Carpathian region, right? So really, the dissertation in the book deals with the Carpathian region more broadly, actually from World War One into World War II, and it's really not just about Jews, even though that's how it started off, right? And it's really about how a state project of attacking a multi-ethnic and multi-religious region in its entirety in order to destroy that multi-religious and multi-ethnic and multilingual society and turn it into a part of Greater Hungary, says the Hungarian state, right? So Yuda Bauer didn't like any of that. He didn't like the arguments that I was advancing about the role of anti-Semitism there. So I was contextualizing anti-Semitism in a certain way, right? So I was removing it from this kind of like, again, decontextualized, the ancient hatred framework, you might say, which is a very strong Zionist framework. So again, I'm answering in fragments about this process of change that happened, in parallel in relation to my work on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and then also in relation to Israel and Israel-Palestine in the specific, context at the time and the siege of Gaza, and I think that probably a major right turning point in that process was Israel's attack on Gaza in 2014. Where at the time I had already actually finished my dissertation, and actually my partner and I, and our daughter was 1 year old at the time. We had returned to Israel. We were trying to find teaching positions in the Israeli academic world because we really wanted to try to be there for various reasons, and some of it is, of course, family and but then came this Israeli attack on Gaza in 2014, and and I think it became clear to me and to my partner that there's no that again, we didn't articulate it to ourselves or to anyone else in this kind of way, but I think it became clear to us that this is turning into the fully genocidal state and society where we don't want to live, and we didn't want to raise our daughter there. And then, we decided that we want to leave, and then the job at Stockton University where I teach since 2016 came up, and here we are.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, most people think, or they only know the history from October 7th, but you've observed through your studies, through your dissertation, and so on, the sort of the uncovering of the settler colony of Israel becoming more and more genocidal, which is interesting because, and it's very courageous. And you also published on the 13th of October, only 6 days after the 7th of October, you published in the textbook Case of Genocide that Shamim mentioned in Jewish Currents. And most people were still processing what happened, but you immediately applied your genocide expertise, if you like, to what Israel was doing in Gaza. Could you take us into that sort of time and moment when you knew that you had to publish and knowing that you get massive backlash, knowing that, and would you do it again? Would you have any regrets about it? Because I know you had a lot of issues with it.
Yeah, I should say this. My dissertation was really about World War II and genocide, um, and really had nothing to do with Palestine, Israel in that sense. It was eventually the book that came out, Genocide in the Carpathians, is quite a significant critique of the paradigm of uniqueness about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Jewish history as well. Actually, that was one of the fights with Yehuda Bauer, my first chapter actually about, which is really about the relations between Jews and their neighbors in the Carpathian region. Anyway, it's of course related because once the Jewish supremacist project of the Israeli state, of the Israeli settler state, is really premised on this idea of uniqueness, the system of uniqueness, right? So in that sense, it's related, but it's after mostly, uh, 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 mostly after. Starting from 2012, I guess, when I was kind of finishing up my dissertation already back in Israel, I started to publish a bit of op-eds in the Israeli press that were, more critical about Holocaust memory and these kinds of things. But mostly when I came here to the U.S., in the years before October 2023, I really started to deal, more. With Israel-Palestine, also in relation to Holocaust memory, but also in relation, for example, to the argument about apartheid, Israel as an apartheid state, and other issues. And I wrote and published a bit, some pieces about Israel-Palestine in the frame of thinking about, mass violence and genocide. Before October 2023. Um, uh, now, and there's no doubt that by that time, after we moved here in 2016, you could say that I had developed by then, a clear anti-Zionist frame of thought, right? Through kind of my identity as a Jew, and actually thinking about my identity as a Jew also through my research on the Holocaust and Jewish history and anti-Semitism. Now, genocide, then what I wrote on 13th of October in that piece in Jewish Currents, I have no regrets about it at all. And I can explain in a bit, why I think that already on 13th of October, actually, we were clearly in the realm of genocide according to international law, right? But I want to say two things before that. One is that, again, if we take Holocaust memory seriously, and unfortunately we haven't, but if we take it seriously, and if we take Never Again seriously, right? And if we take genocide prevention seriously, the whole idea is that we don't deal with genocides only once they're over, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea is that as we teach our students, right, to notice unfolding processes and red flags, issues that should raise the alarm, right, in order indeed to prevent or to stop a process from escalating to full-fledged genocide. So in that sense, it's very important to say that when some people responded to my Jewish Currents piece, and some still do, they say, well, how dare you, how could you do that, only less than a week after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, and one way to respond to this is to say, this is exactly what we should do. What we should do if we take seriously Holocaust memory and genocide prevention, right? Even if it was not yet fully genocidal, and I argue that it was in a minute, but even if it was not, right? The Genocide Convention is activated not when we have full-fledged genocide, but when we have a significant risk of genocide.
Mm.
And we, without a doubt, had a significant risk of genocide by the 13th of October, right?
Well,
so that's, go ahead, yeah.
No, I wanted to ask you just because I think in a way there's a significant, you could say that from almost from the beginning of the creation of Israel, because there was this idea to spirit people away, or various ways it was put. But I didn't want to, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt your flow.
No, that was exactly my second point. That was exactly my second point was the ongoing Nakba framework. And here to say that international law, I think, is a very important framework. And I think it's incredibly important now that if we have time, we can talk more about it, that we're in a moment now that the flawed international legal system that we had before 7th of October 2023, that in a way brought us to October 2023, is now in a process of change. It's under attack, primarily by the US and Israel, the international legal system, which I think should point everyone who is not supporting Israel and the US that we should probably try to save the international legal system and change it significantly. But this or the other, it's not the only framework. And if we take the Nakba, what we might call the Nakba rationale, including the ongoing Nakba since the 1948 Nakba, then it is about elimination. It is about the Greater Israel Project, which is maximum territory, maximum Jews, minimum Palestinians, ideally no Palestinians at all. And in that sense, it doesn't really matter. In that sense, right? It doesn't really matter if we're talking about genocide or not, right? Because we are talking about an eliminationist project, right? That that actually begins with Zionist settler colonialism before 1948, of course, right? It continues in the 1948 Nakba, which was, again, I think that a lot of people who know about the Nakba do not understand how extremely violent the 1948 Nakba was, including massacres of about 15,000 Palestinians. And then the ongoing Nakba, again, in the ongoing Nakba, we can then add and say, through incredible violations of international law, that, of course, Israeli impunity, based on this idea of uniqueness, by the way, Holocaust unique, Israel unique, right, were allowed to just, unfold in front of our eyes because they were in the frame of what's called slow violence, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what's been confusing to some people that we know, and have heard talking about this, is they feel like a genocide means 6 million people, or within a very short space of time, and that's horrific, and it should be remembered, but it is not a cause for perpetrating another one. So, but going back to let's talk. Sorry.
Just to say something about this, which is so very important. Genocide, there's only one agreed upon definition of genocide in international law, right? It's in the Convention in 48, and there's no mention in the Convention that genocide needs to look like the Holocaust. That's one thing, right? The second thing is that the Holocaust wasn't like that. It wasn't like the Germans decided one day we're going to murder all the Jews within our reach, right?
Yeah.
No, it was an unfolding process that actually started from what we would call today ethnic cleansing, right? This idea of creating a Germany and then an expanding Germany without Jews. The Nazis reached their decision to murder all Jews within their reach very late, actually, in the spring of 1942. This is when the decision about the final solution really is made, most likely, right? Spring of 1942. So a lot of people who say, well, how it can't be a genocide because it doesn't look like the Holocaust. In the vast majority of cases, these people don't even know what the Holocaust was, actually, right?
Yeah. But going back to October 2023, walk us through what you were seeing viscerally for us, just to get, what were the key things that made you think,
right,
here's a genocide unfolding in real time that I need to say something about? What were these things? Because as you say, there's creating conditions to destroy the group. There's killing, there's causing serious bodily harm. There's all these things that Francesca Albanese have tried to communicate, and you. What were the specific things that you were seeing that made you speak out?
So, I think this is a question that brings us back to the framework of international law, right? And to the convention, and to the definition of the crime of genocide, which is actually quite simple, right? For the crime of genocide, and it's important to say, by the way, that people understand that there's no hierarchy of crimes in international law. There's nothing in international law that says that war crimes is less severe than genocide, actually, right? Uh, um, there's different crimes. They're all considered egregious crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. Uh, um, and there's different elements of the crime. For genocide, there is the element of intent. So we need to show what's called in the convention intent to destroy, right? One of the four groups, national, ethnic, religious, or national, in whole or in part. So there's also, right, the intent to destroy is not about the entire group, but it's only part of the group. What is part of the group is a big debate, right? But it's in whole or in part. And we need to show that there's an intent to destroy the group as such. That is, the only reason for their destruction is their group membership, right? And then there's various acts of genocide, as you said, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily mental harm. I'm jumping to the fourth one. There is preventing birth. Then the fifth one, transferring children from one group, forcibly transferring children from one group to the other. And then there's the third one, which is particularly relevant for our argument here, that is creating conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. Now let's go back to the 13th of October and doing this very, very briefly here, right? So let's talk about intent. First of all, intent. I mean, immediately after 7th of October, we have an explosions of clear, explicit, and open expressions of intent to destroy by people with what's called in international law command authority. That is, state leaders, senior army officers, war cabinet ministers, right? Using various mechanisms also of dehumanization. This is where Holocaust memory, all the red lights are supposed to flash, right? Dehumanization. So, Yoav on 9th of October, total siege order, where he referred to Palestinians as human animals. Think about the language, total siege, which really takes the 16-year-old siege by then on Gaza and upgrades it to total siege, which by its nature does not discriminate between civilians, combatants, Hamas, not Hamas. It's total, it's everyone, right? Then we have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and others using the Amalek image, right? So the biblical story about the Israelites destroying Amalek, a group perceived as the ultimate evil, as the ultimate enemy of the Israelites entirely, right? Everyone. And of course, the weaponization of the Holocaust by referring to Palestinians as Nazis, right? And by referring to the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October as a continuation of the Holocaust, right? So again, I mean, this really takes decontextualization to its logical conclusion, right? There is no history. There's just a unique attack against, Jews eternally, right? So there's numerous expressions of intent to destroy, and it's very important to say that incredibly, we are continuing to listen and to hear, right, and to read clear, open, explicit expressions of intent to destroy, right, until today. So these were not just things that happened on the heat of the moment, right, immediately after the 7th of October, right? But even if they were, and we're talking about the 13th of October, so we are talking about this, immediate period after the 7th of October, there's still expressions of intent to destroy, right? The fact that they were made on the heat of the moment does not make them any less genocidal, right? So intent we have, but what's very important in international law is to show, right, and this is very crucial, to show the link between the expressions of intent to destroy and the dynamics of violence on the ground, okay? Where did I see this on the 13th of October? This is very significant because on the 13th of October, we have Israel's first quote-unquote evacuation order, right? So basically pretty much arbitrarily dividing the Gaza Strip into north and south. That's an Israeli division, and then ordering more than 1 million Palestinians to move from the north to the south. But what was the context? Of course, the context was, as I said, total siege. And because of the 16-year-old siege, We knew because because Palestinians were sending text messages and voice messages immediately after 7th of October, right? These are actually kind of testimonies, we might say, and they were reporting on how they already felt in these first few days of the total siege, the impact of the total siege because of the 16-year-old siege, right? So they were already experiencing lack of food and clean water and medical supplies and all these kinds of things, right? So there's total siege. There's intense bombings. We forget that October was one of the most horrendous and violent months of the campaign, right? Intense bombings where, again, Israeli leaders and senior army officers are speaking openly about the intent to cause maximum damage, right, in their own words, right? Um, uh, and this is the conditions in the language of the UN Genocide Convention, where we have the evacuation order. Now, we also know at the time, again, because of these testimonies of Palestinians, that Israel was actually using the US-made 2,000-ton bombs to bomb in those days. Already on 12th and 13th of October, we have bombings of routes that Israel had designated as safe, and it was actually using its 2,000-ton bombs to bomb the south, right? The area that it had designated at the time as safe. That is what led Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, to call these Israeli evacuation orders, right, humanitarian camouflage. Because they're actually a weaponization of international humanitarian law, where the evacuation orders are not meant to protect civilians, right, but actually in this case to enhance their targeting, right? So what we have by 13th of October is expressions of intent to destroy, total siege, and indiscriminate bombings. But now the evacuation order actually really brings us directly into the realm of genocide, right? Because we really have this connection between the intention. So we have the evacuation order can be seen really as a mechanism to enhance the destruction of Palestinians, or in the language of the UN Genocide Convention, to create conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. Okay? Now, all this means that at the very least, we're in significant risk of genocide, which activates the convention, right? But Israel then, from then until today, has actually done exactly what it said it will do, right? This is the reason, for example, and now I'm, of course, going beyond the 13th of October and my piece in Jewish Currents, but this is the reason that, for example, when we take just the official numbers, just the UN official numbers, Israel has killed more than 17,000 children, Palestinian children in Gaza, and we know that the real numbers are far higher, but just the official numbers, right? And we know actually from the legal case against Myanmar and the International Court of Justice, the case that Gambia brought against Myanmar in the case of its assault on Rohingya Muslims, right? That the targeting of children points to genocidal intent, right? The numbers in the Myanmar case are far lower than the numbers in the Gaza case, right? The targeting of 70,000 children, for example, right, is a clear indication of genocidal intent, is a clear indication that Israel was indeed already on the 13th of October, and it since then was, again, in the language of the convention, creating conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. And then, of course, we can talk about the massive destruction of infrastructure, the bombing of places where there were only agricultural fields, right? The destruction of museums, archives, culture, right? Which is very typical of all genocidal cases, right? So this kind of total destruction of everything, which is exactly what the Gaza Strip today looks like, total destruction, right? This is the reason that, my good friend and colleague, Israeli historian Amos Goldberg, in his argument for Israel's attack on Gaza as genocide, he said, when we look at Gaza today, right, what we see is total destruction, right? If this is non-genocide, what is genocide? Even if you put aside, right, the legal argumentations and everything that I laid out here, right? There's very strong, of course, we have the ICJ case that South Africa brought against Israel on the charge of genocide. We have Francesca Albanese's very detailed and meticulous reports, three now, right? Two on the genocide, one, the recent one on the economy of genocide. We have Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem's report. We have so many actually Holocaust and genocide scholars like me, right, who later, right, have been talking about Israel's genocide in Gaza, right? That it's not for nothing that this is called the first live stream genocide, right? Because we have a mountain of evidence now pointing to that. On the 13th of October, right, in my view, there was enough evidence to show that we are at the very least in the realm of genocide and the significant risk of genocide, which if, again, to reiterate that point, if we take seriously Holocaust memory, if we take seriously Jewish history, if we take seriously the struggle against anti-Semitism and genocide prevention, what I wrote on 13th of October was what every person in my field should have written.
Yeah. But you had the guts and the courage to do it. And as you said, Raz, I mean, they destroyed the schools, the hospitals, the universities, the medical system, everything, just brought it to its knees. And speaking of universities, I mean, you were offered to lead the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, but they rescinded their offer after you published. And despite all that and all the institutional pressure, your continuing work, and you continue to speak out on the genocide and all that's been happening, it's very, very brave of you. But the majority of people, even in academia, they're still sort of protecting the settler colony of Israel. And despite all that, can you give examples of how your work has impacted what's going on right now, and how is it shifting the understanding of what's happening in Gaza? Do you see a shift? Do you see you'll get more support, or how can we have people who are listening to this podcast to see what they can do to support scholars who face this sort of Zionist backlash, if you like? Many questions, sorry.
No, that's fine. I don't think that I'm the issue here, I have to say, right? I have a tenured position at Stockton University in New Jersey. You know, I look like, I'm fine. Really, I mean, and yes, I have paid a price. Um, uh, you know, most significantly in the rescinding of the offer that I had to lead the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the University of Minnesota last summer in 2024. And there were other ways in which I paid a price, but I knew what I was doing. I think it's a very small price to pay. I think that when we think about the academic world, right, then of course Palestinians are under incredible attack. Arab allies of Palestinians in the U.S. academic world, in the European academic world, are under incredible attack. Yes, anti-Zionist Jews are also under incredible attack, and there's so much to say about this, and we don't have enough time. But I don't think that people like me, right, senior scholars with tenure, this is not. I don't. I think this is our responsibility right now, right? There are much more. I'm not disregarding significant issues like people's livelihoods, right, and even personal safety in some cases, right? But I'm just saying that again, if we take seriously what this field, right, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, is based on, it's based on genocide prevention, right? It's based on this idea of never again, right? And we've been disregarding really. I mean, I'm writing a whole book now on the way in which actually what we call global Holocaust memory has not only failed, but it has actually, very actively facilitated and brought us to where we are today, right? So there's, global Holocaust memory, I'm talking about the institutes, right? For example, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, the institutes of global Holocaust memory, I would say, have played an active part in bringing us where we are today. They haven't failed in their mission. In a way, they've accomplished their mission, but that's a different, again, that's a different discussion. Maybe if I ever finish the book, we can talk about that one day. But but now, I will say that, so it's not just me, and we mentioned Francesca Albanese, but there's many people, including many Palestinians and Palestinian scholars and Palestinian activists. So there is, I think, significant impact that the work of many people and organizations around the world have had. Now, I should say, and I'm looking at the time. I know that we're nearly in an hour right now, but I should say that it's very difficult. On the one hand, it's very difficult to talk about the impact of this work, right? We're nearly 22 months, into this unfolding live-streamed genocide, witnessing horrific, atrocities on a daily basis. And I think about the thousands of videos of the Israeli officers and soldiers that they themselves proudly, record and upload to social media. Gaza, as many have said, is destroyed, right? There is an intensified attack on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. In some places, the forcible displacement, extremely violent forcible displacement is unfolding in unbelievable fast pace, right? None of this receives almost no media at all, no attention. So on the one hand, it's very difficult to talk about the impact of all this work. We could actually say the opposite. We can say that, we've failed. We continue to fail, right? The academic world, international law, right? It continue to fail because, or continue to demonstrate our irrelevance or our impotence, or I don't know, this is, here we are, right? 22 months in. We now have the Israeli Prime Minister and his ministers, together with the U.S. President, speaking openly about creating a massive concentration camp in the south of the Gaza Strip in order to realize, again, the greater Israel idea, right, of forcibly removing all Palestinians from Gaza. We have, grotesque use of the word humanitarian in relation to starvation policies in Gaza, right? So, I mean, our language has, been turned completely upside down as well in this process. So that's on the one hand, right? Now, at the same time, I don't want to say on the other hand, but I want to say at the same time, we do have impact for this work, and I'll articulate it. I will articulate this very briefly in the little time that we have left. But I think it's important to say that, uh, before October 2023. So, before October 20, I'll say this. Before October 2023, we lived in a world with more than 120 million forcibly displaced people around the world, right? So even if we don't consider Palestine, if we put Palestine aside for a second, the international legal and political system was an unbelievable failure, right? Discarded 120 million people, right, that were, ejected out of the nation state system, refugees and other forcibly displaced people. More than half of this number are children, that is under the age of 18, right? Now, one of the things that happened with the Gaza genocide, right, is that it has exposed the immensely flawed international legal and political system. And because this whole system was really based, again, to go back to how I started our interview, on this idea of uniqueness. The Holocaust and Jews in Israel is unique, and therefore, when the Israeli state emerges in relation to the crime of genocide, this is very important. Holocaust unique, genocide. So that's the origins of this Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is a very strange combination. If the Holocaust was a genocide, what is this combination? In the title of my field, but uh, uh, and therefore Israel emerges as a state that's perceived in international law in relation to the new crime of genocide after World War II as a state that cannot perpetrate any crime, right? That is the origins of impunity in the international law for Israel, right? And as long as the violence was slow, as long as it was slow violence, we can all play the game, right? Even though the atrocities and the violations of international law were right in front of our eyes. After the 7th of October, which is an accident of the system, it was never supposed to happen. It happened because Israeli Jews are imagining that they're fighting a colonial war, right, against barbarians, Nazis, Amalek, what have you, right? And therefore they can say and do anything, which, by the way, points to the origins of international law. That is, international law emerges in order to regulate wars between civilized people, that is, Europeans. It was never supposed to apply to colonial warfare, that is, to put down indigenous uprisings. That's how Israeli Jews are understanding what they're doing. That's why we have this accident in the system. That's why the system now, right, where Israeli exceptionalism, Israeli impunity, Israeli uniqueness, Jews uniqueness, Holocaust uniqueness, Holocaust and genocide framework, all of this has now been exposed, right? Whatever we say, we cannot go back, right? The facade has fallen, right? Now, what the impact of that now is very significant, okay? Uh, because if we understand that we desperately need a functioning international legal system, if we remember, and we usually don't, if we remember the 120 million forcibly displaced people that I just mentioned, right? If we remember that we are already living in a climate catastrophe and in a warming planet, we will live in a world of hundreds of millions of forcibly displaced people. I mean, half of humanity lives today in areas where it will not be able to continue living in the next 30, 40, 50 years. That may include also Israel-Palestine, but that's a different issue to discuss. But the point is that we need international law desperately, right? The impact of the work then, if to go back to this, is that there is incredible effort now in changing the international legal system, right? And this is it's a very difficult struggle. We're up against the US and Israel and some European states who very much want to dismantle the international legal system, right? But we now have, incredible support around the world, right? Because again, a lot of the support for Gaza and Palestine in the global South, particularly, is not necessarily because people know a lot about Palestine, or even, I would say, even care about Palestinians or know about Gaza, or no, they recognize in this moment themselves how they've been discarded by the international legal system, right? And because this touches the heart, right, Israel and genocide and the Holocaust, right, there's a potential for change. And this is where, in my view, the impact of the work is very important. Of course, if we are able to push this forward and realize this process of this potential for change, it will also have an incredible impact, I think, on a future in Palestine, Israel, right? A future for everyone between the river and the sea, right? For Jews, Palestinians, others who live there, for a different kind of state. It could not be a Jewish state. It has to be a state that recognizes the rights, the dignity, the belonging of everyone who lives between the river and the sea. It can't be a settler state. It can't be a Jewish supremacist state, right? It can't be a unique state in that sense, right? So that is the impact. The impact that is we're in the process of this struggle. It's an incredible, there's a lot of people. I have to say, I really think that I'm one of the more minor people in the struggle. Really, there is incredible people, and there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of Palestinians, scholars, Palestinian activists at the forefront of the struggle, but then a lot of other people around the world again who have actually been doing this for a long time, also before October 23, right? Uh, and we've been, for the most part, ignoring them. But that's where the impact, I think, is very important, right? And that's also just one last point about the impact. That's also where I think there is potential to really speak to broad audiences, right? And to explain the significance of this moment. Now, again, all of this does not, the destruction of Gaza is just a fact, right? And none of this takes away from this destruction. And I always, in a way, there's, this is just a fact that, when I think about the Holocaust again, if to go back to this just for a second, the Nazi project of destroying the East European Jewish world that had existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, right, within a multi-ethnic and multi-religious and multilingual sphere of millions and millions of people, right? This is not about an ideal world. It was a world of conflict and cooperation and good times and bad times and everything, but it was this Jewish life for hundreds of years, right, in this world. The Nazis destroyed that world forever, and it's not coming back, right? The fact of destruction, so that there's something incredibly sad, right? Deeply, deeply sad about our time, and there's no way to really deal with it besides confronting it in this way, right? But
Yeah.
there is this also impact, and we're in the process of the impact. We might fail because we're up against incredible power and forces, but we might not fail. And because we might not fail, the struggle is absolutely worth it.
Yeah. And that's a great segue into one of my final questions, really, which is that, it has become kind of an awakening and a moral clarity for people that they haven't had for some time. And what advice do you have for scholars, for activists, for any of us who feel overwhelmed by what's going on, but we want to make an impact? What's one last message you could give to our listeners to carry forward about, using genuine awareness of the Holocaust, of history, to stand with Palestine against this live stream genocide?
I'd say three key things, really. One is insist on the truth in the most radical way. We are living in a time where there is an assault on the truth, on the undocumented. I said this a number of times. Some of these discussions feel like I'm standing outside in the middle of the day, the sun is up, and, someone comes up to me and says, it's the middle of the night. And if you say it's the middle of the day, you're an anti-Semite, right? This is how some of this feels, right? And it's not only about Gaza, by the way, right? We live in a time where conspiracy thinking is blowing up, right? So this has a larger context, especially if you look at what's happening in the US right now. So first of all, I would say, I would say really, I use this word, a radical insistence on the truth in any interaction that people have, right? With family, friends, with themselves. That's one thing. The other thing is for this struggle to succeed, right? We need a lot of different kind of small struggles in different places, in different contexts, right? And this has to be a collective endeavor, right? Now, so people have to, if people understand, and that's why I mentioned the climate catastrophe, because that's a way to get people to understand that this is Gaza. If we think about global warming and the climate catastrophe and the assault on the international legal system by the US and Israel, Gaza is a way, right? Is basically a model of how to deal with unwanted populations in this world, in this climate catastrophe world. Gaza is our future unless we fight against it, right? But this has to be a collective endeavor. And there's so many ways in which, so there's a lot of different little struggles in different contexts. People, it's very easy to find, right? A sphere, a group that fits, people may feel comfortable more doing one thing rather than another, being with, one group of people rather than another. It doesn't really matter, right? Uh, um, uh, and so insisting on truth, working collectively, right? This isn't nothing will happen by, individual from an individual perspective. And this is probably mostly to Americans in that sense, right? Where individualism is a religion, right? But it's really about thinking through the capitalist system where individualism is very strong, really everywhere, right? Um, so insisting on truth, working in collaborations and groups, but mostly it's also about uh, uh, persisting and about creating what we might call routines of resistance, right? So it's not just about going to a protest. It could be also going to a protest, but protest, is just one thing that people can do. It has to be, we have to think about the struggle as something that is long-term. It's very difficult. It includes a lot of daily elements that we need to turn into routine, right? Including the insisting on truth. Whatever work we do with specific groups that we find, right? It has to be continuous, right? We have to devote the time for it, right? We have to make sacrifices with our time. But people have to understand, so these are the three elements, right? Insisting on truth, working collaboratively, and turning this into a routine, right? This will not be about, heroic deeds, right? This will not be about just going to a protest and feeling good and then going back home, to watch the next Netflix series or, whatever in that sense, right? This will be this is a long-term struggle, right, against incredible forces, right? The one last thing I will say about this, which I think is very important, is that we have to understand that the struggle, again, we're up against incredible forces, but the struggle is possible because ultimately in the world today, there's a minority of people, right? There's a minority of people who want to turn the world of the majority of people into hell, right? Gaza is a model, right? But the majority of people don't want that. We need to find a way to make this point constantly for more and more people, right? But people need to understand that, yes, the forces we're up against are incredible, and it's very scary. I'm scared most of the time. Really, I am. But we are the majority. We really are the majority, right? In the world, talking about the world. The Israel-Palestine case, unfortunately, Israeli Jewish society, its vast majority is fully genocidal. It's a different issue. We can also think about that. But in the world, in the struggle, right, we are the majority, right? So insist on truth, work collaboratively, make it a routine, whatever it is, right? If everyone makes a routine, really routines of resistance, right, on a regular basis, right, the cumulative effect of that will be incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly, I think, what we started this podcast for, and what we like to express at the end of it, which I'll do now, which is that we really feel it is our collective responsibility to speak out against injustice, and we thank you for doing that. And we know that you've had personal stresses and been passed over for opportunities for work as a result, and it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. But as Edward Said wrote, and it seems to kind of speak to a lot of what you've been telling us today, you cannot continue to victimize someone else just because you yourself were a victim once. So it just remains for me to say to our listeners and viewers that if you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like it, to share it, to subscribe, because that really does help us to amplify voices grounded in justice and truth. Raz, thank you again for your courage, your insights, and your unwavering solidarity with the truth.
Well, thank you so much, Shamim and Hanan. It was thank you for the opportunity again to speak about these issues, to think through them, to engage, and it's a pleasure talking with both of you.
Thank you. And I look forward to your next book, Raz. And I'm also going to wrap just to say that stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, speak up, and create continuous routines of resistance as Raz has just shared with us. And most importantly, take action. Our collective endeavor and voices will make a change. Again, Raz, we agree on that. So in solidarity, see you all next time. And shukran, Raz, and thank you for all that you do for the world in general and for Palestine in particular. Shukran.
Thank you so much.